On Tuesday, September 19th, 1848, Eliza Cooper consumed a cup of tea prepared by her sister-in-law, Sarah Dazley. By midnight, violent convulsions gripped her body. A village surgeon was summoned at dawn. The coroner's inquest papers, preserved in the Bedfordshire archives, document the investigation that followed. The incident occurred at number 4, Duck Lane, in the village of Wrestlingworth, shortly after 7 o'clock in the evening. Sarah Dazley, a widow of 32 years, had prepared supper in the ground-floor kitchen, a room measuring 12 feet by 14, with a brick floor and a black leaded range dominating one wall. The air held the combined scents of boiled mutton, damp wool, and the faint, ever-present tang of the nearby chalk stream. Eliza Cooper, aged 24 and married to Sarah's brother, had arrived at 6:30, complaining of a headache. Sarah Dazley poured water from a brown earthenware jug into a copper kettle and set it to boil on the hob. She used a tin teaspoon to measure black tea leaves from a caddy on the mantel, adding them to a blue and white striped porcelain teapot. Eliza Cooper accepted the cup, a plain white china vessel with a hairline crack running from rim to base, at 7:10. She took her first sip, noted the taste was uncommonly bitter, but drank it down on her hostess's insistence that it was a remedy for her ailment. By 8 o'clock, Eliza complained of a burning sensation in her throat and stomach. She vomited into the hearth, the contents staining the ashes a yellowish brown. Her husband, William Cooper, was sent for and arrived at 9:30, finding his wife retching violently into a basin, her face pale and clammy, her hands clutching her abdomen. He dispatched a neighbour's boy on horseback to fetch Mr. George Foster, the village surgeon, who resided 3 miles distant in Potton. The boy returned at 11:40, alone. Foster was attending a difficult childbirth and could not come until morning. Throughout the night, Eliza's condition deteriorated. Convulsions began shortly after midnight, causing her limbs to thrash against the rope-strung bedstead in the small upstairs chamber. Her breathing grew laboured and rasping. William Cooper and Sarah Dazley took turns applying cold cloths to her forehead. At 5:17, as a grey dawn light seeped through the small leaded window, Eliza Cooper ceased breathing. Her body lay still upon the bed, clad in a calico nightdress, her eyes open and fixed on the cracked plaster ceiling. William Cooper sent the same boy for the surgeon once more and for the parish constable. George Foster arrived at 6:45, carrying his black leather medical bag. He noted the time of death as approximately 5:15, recorded the symptoms described, and observed the corpse. He saw no marks of violence. The constable, Thomas Barrett, a farm labourer who served in the role part-time, arrived at 7:20. He took statements from William Cooper and Sarah Dazley in the kitchen, his pen scratching slowly across the pages of his pocketbook. The room was cold, the fire having died hours before. At 8 o'clock, Constable Barrett informed them he would report the matter to the coroner for the district. He sealed the room where the death occurred, using a strip of paper and wax impressed with his own signet ring, and took possession of the teacup, the teapot, and the remains of the tea leaves from the caddy, wrapping each in separate sheets of newspaper. He departed for the coroner's office in Bedford at 9 o'clock, the parcels secured in a saddlebag. Coal smoke seeped through stone vents, mixing with dampness and the faint odour of carbolic. The coroner, Mr. John William Hall, received Constable Barrett's report on the afternoon of September 20th. He ordered an inquest to be opened the following day at the Bull's Head public house in Wrestlingworth. Parish relief records, examined later, showed William Cooper's household had been in arrears on their cottage rent for 5 weeks, totalling £1, 4 shillings. An insurance policy on Eliza Cooper's life, issued by the Prudential Assurance Company 18 months prior, was discovered among her effects. It promised a payment of £10 upon her death, a sum equivalent to nearly half a year's wages for an agricultural labourer in the district. The inquest jury of 14 men viewed the body at the Cooper cottage at 10 o'clock on the 21st. George Foster, the surgeon, testified to the symptoms and his initial examination. He stated that while sudden death from natural causes was possible, the violence of the convulsions and the rapid onset following ingestion of the tea warranted chemical analysis. The coroner ordered a post-mortem examination. This was conducted at 2 o'clock that afternoon in an outbuilding behind the Bull's Head, used occasionally as a temporary mortuary. The room was cold, lit by 2 oil lamps that cast long shadows on the whitewashed walls. Present was Surgeon Foster, a second surgeon named Henry Phillips from Bedford, who assisted the coroner and the jury foreman. Foster made the initial incision with a scalpel, opening the abdominal cavity. He noted the stomach lining appeared inflamed and irritated. He carefully removed the stomach and its contents, placing them in a clean glass jar provided by Phillips. Sections of the liver and kidneys were also excised and sealed in separate jars. The organs emitted a faint, sweetish odour that mixed with the smell of blood and carbolic soap used to clean the table. The jars were labelled, sealed with cork and wax, and placed in a wooden box lined with straw. Constable Barrett conveyed the box by cart to the laboratory of Mr. John Sterry, a consulting chemist in Bedford, arriving at 5 o'clock. Sterry's laboratory was a cluttered room on the ground floor of a Georgian townhouse, filled with the scents of chemicals, glassware, and burning coal from a small furnace. He received the jars and signed a receipt in Barrett's pocketbook. The analysis began the next morning, September 22nd. Sterry employed the Marsh Test, a procedure developed 15 years prior. He placed samples of the stomach contents in a flask with zinc and sulfuric acid, generating arsine gas. This gas was passed through a heated glass tube. A metallic mirror deposit formed on the cool part of the tube. Sterry measured its quantity against known standards. The process took 5 hours. He repeated the test with samples from the liver and kidneys. He prepared his certificate at 3 o'clock, dipping his steel nib pen into black ink. Arsenic, sufficient for a fatal dose. Constable Barrett returned to Wrestlingworth with the chemist's certificate at 6 o'clock that evening. He proceeded directly to the cottage of Sarah Dazley, accompanied by a second constable from Potton. They found her in her garden, digging potatoes. The light was fading and a chill wind rustled the leaves of a nearby elder tree. Barrett informed her she was required to accompany him to the magistrate. She asked no questions. She wiped her hands on her apron, removed it, and hung it on a nail inside her back door. She put on a woolen shawl over her grey dress. The walk to the constable's lockup in Potton, a distance of 2.5 miles, was conducted in near silence. Her boots made soft thuds on the packed earth of the lane. She was placed in a holding cell at 7:45. The magistrate, Sir John Burgoyne, was notified and scheduled a hearing for the following morning. In the cell, Sarah Dazley was offered bread and water. The constable recorded her initial statement at 8:20. "I made the tea as I always do. I drank none myself that evening. I cannot account for the poison." The committal hearing convened at 10 o'clock on September 23rd in the magistrate's room at the Potton Town Hall, a single-story brick building with high, narrow windows. The room was crowded. News of the arrest had spread through the village. Sir John Burgoyne presided from a raised desk of dark oak. Sarah Dazley stood in a small railed dock, her hands clasped before her. The clerk read the charge. Administering a deadly poison with intent to murder. Constable Thomas Barrett presented the evidence. The seized teacup, teapot and teacaddy, now labelled as Exhibits A, B and C. He summarised the chemist's certificate. Surgeon George Foster testified to the post-mortem findings and the symptoms observed. The coroner, John William Hall, presented the inquisition papers, which included the jury's finding of willful murder by person or persons unknown. William Cooper gave testimony, his voice low. He stated his wife and his sister had been on tolerable terms, though there had been words over a loan of 2 shillings the previous month. He confirmed the insurance policy existed, but claimed he knew little of its particulars. Sir John Burgoyne listened without expression, making occasional notes on a sheet of paper. After 2 hours of testimony, he addressed Sarah Dazley, asking if she wished to say anything. She replied, "I am innocent, sir." The magistrate bound over all witnesses for trial at the next Bedfordshire Assizes. He committed Sarah Dazley to Bedford Gaol to await trial. The hearing concluded at 12:45. Sarah Dazley was taken from the dock by 2 constables, led out a side door to a waiting closed carriage for the journey to Bedford. The carriage, drawn by a single horse, departed at 1 o'clock. The journey of 11 miles took 3 hours over rutted roads. She arrived at the gatehouse of Bedford Gaol at 4 o'clock. The prison register records her admission, name, age, charge, committal date. Her personal effects were catalogued: 1 grey dress, 1 woolen shawl, 1 pair of leather boots, 1 cotton handkerchief, 2 copper pennies. These were placed in a storage sack. She was examined by the prison surgeon, who noted she was of sound mind and body, though fatigued. She was assigned to the female wing. The jail's massive iron gate closed behind her with a final resonant clang. The following days saw preparation for the assizes. The prosecution brief was prepared by the clerk to the magistrates, compiling all statements and the chemist's certificate. Notice was sent to the Home Office, as the charge was capital. The Bedfordshire Chronicle published a brief account on September 30th, column 4, page 3. "A woman named Dazley has been committed to our county jail, charged with the murder of her sister-in-law by poison at Wrestlingworth. The inquest found willful murder." No further commentary appeared. In Wrestlingworth, neighbours were interviewed again by a detective officer from the county constabulary, established just 9 years prior. Their statements added little. Most described Sarah Dazley as quiet and keeping to herself. The insurance agent confirmed the policy was valid and in force. The file grew thicker. At the jail, Sarah Dazley was informed she would be represented by counsel appointed by the court. Mr. Jeremiah Jones, a barrister of Gray's Inn, accepted the brief. His first consultation with his client was scheduled for October 10th. The distant clang of iron gates echoed through the yard, followed by the scrape of boots on stone. Bedford Gaol, constructed of grey limestone, housed its female prisoners in a separate block within the inner perimeter wall. Sarah Dazley's cell was on the first floor, accessed by a metal staircase. The cell measured 7 feet in length, 5 feet in width, and 9 feet to the ceiling. The walls were bare stone, whitewashed once but now stained with patches of damp that darkened after rain. A single barred window, 18 inches high and 12 wide, was set high in the exterior wall, offering a narrow vertical view of an exercise yard paved with cracked flagstones. The light that entered was thin and grey, never reaching the far corner. Furnishings consisted of an iron bedstead bolted to the floor, its mattress a canvas sack stuffed with straw that rustled with every movement. A single coarse woolen blanket, dyed a faded brown, lay folded at its foot. A wooden stool without a back stood beneath the window. A small wooden table, 12 inches square, was fixed to the wall opposite the bed. On it sat a tin drinking cup and a clay bowl. A covered bucket for slops stood in the corner nearest the door. The door itself was solid oak, reinforced with iron bands, featuring a Judas hole at eye level that could be slid open from the outside. The air was perpetually cold, carrying a composite odour of carbolic disinfectant, damp stone, stale straw, and the faint, sour trace of unwashed bodies. The daily routine commenced at 6 o'clock with the ringing of a handbell along the corridor. The cell door would be unlocked by a wardress and the slop bucket exchanged for an empty one. At 6:15, breakfast was delivered. A tin cup of weak, unsweetened tea and a 6-ounce portion of brown bread, its texture dense and gritty. The wardress would stand in the doorway until the bread was consumed. At 7 o'clock, prisoners were taken in pairs to the exercise yard for 1 hour, regardless of weather. They walked in a circle, 15 feet apart, under the watch of a wardress who stood in a central wooden shelter. Conversation was forbidden. Sarah Dazley's steps were measured, her eyes most often on the ground. At 9 o'clock, she was returned to her cell. The chaplain, Reverend Charles Mortimer, visited on Tuesdays and Fridays at 11. He would stand just inside the cell door, his prayer book in hand, and read from the scriptures for 10 minutes. He asked if she wished to pray. She usually shook her head. On one visit, recorded in the chaplain's journal, she asked a question, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will they let me see my children before?" Reverend Mortimer stated he would inquire, but made no promise. The prison surgeon visited weekly on Wednesday afternoons. He would ask her to state her name, the date, and if she felt any illness. He checked her pulse, looked at her tongue, and noted her responses in a ledger. Appetite poor, but taking sustenance. No fever. Spirits low. Dinner arrived at noon. A pint of soup, usually a thin broth of potatoes and turnips, or on alternate days, 8 ounces of sweet pudding. The food was delivered in a tin pail and ladled into her clay bowl. The spoon was tin, with a blunt edge. She ate slowly. The afternoons were silent, broken only by the sounds of other cell doors opening and closing, distant coughs, and the occasional shout from the male wing, muffled by stone. She was allowed no books, no needlework. She sat on the stool or lay on the bed. The wardress noted in the daily log that on October 5th, Sarah Dazley gave her bread ration to a younger prisoner in the exercise yard, a girl of 18 imprisoned for theft, saying nothing as she pressed it into the girl's hand. Supper at 5 o'clock was a repetition of breakfast, tea and bread. The cell was locked for the night at 8 o'clock. A single gas jet in the corridor, turned low, cast a faint orange glow through the Judas hole, creating a thin line of light on the opposite wall. The nights were long, sounds carried, the measured tread of the night watchman's boots every half hour, the creak of his leather gear, the jingle of his keys, the sighing of the wind around the building. On October 10th, her counsel, Mr. Jeremiah Jones, visited. The meeting took place in a small interview room near the governor's office, a wardress present. Jones, a man in his 50s with spectacles, explained the trial procedure. He reviewed the prosecution evidence. He asked her to recount the events of September 19th again. Her hands, resting on the plain wooden table, trembled slightly as she spoke. She stated she had purchased the tea 3 days prior from a travelling huckster, that the caddy had been left on the mantel, that anyone could have accessed it. Jones made notes. He informed her the trial was set for the spring assizes, likely March. She returned to her cell. The days began to blend, marked only by the weekly bath, the chaplain's visits, and the changing pattern of frost on the inside of her window as winter deepened. Frost gathered thick on the inside of the cell window, obscuring the view of the exercise yard. The Bedfordshire Spring Assizes opened at the Shire Hall in Bedford on Thursday, March 8, 1849. The courtroom was a high-ceilinged chamber with dark wood panelling and tall windows that let in a cold, clear light. The public gallery was full. The case had attracted considerable local attention. The judge, Mr. Justice Coleridge, took his seat on the bench at 10 o'clock precisely. The sheriff and his officers stood to attention. Sarah Dazley was brought up from the cells below and placed in the dock. She wore the same grey dress, now cleaner but visibly worn at the cuffs. Her hair was neatly braided and pinned. The clerk read the indictment. that she feloniously, wilfully, and of malice aforethought did administer a certain deadly poison called arsenic to Eliza Cooper with intent to murder. She pleaded not guilty. The jury of 12 men, farmers, shopkeepers, a miller, were sworn in, each placing his hand on the Bible. The prosecution was led by Mr. Anthony Brown, QC. In his opening, he summarized the case: the visit, the tea, the rapid illness and death, the chemical finding of arsenic, and the financial motive of the insurance policy. The first witness was William Cooper. He testified to his wife's health before the visit, her symptoms, and her death. Under cross-examination by Mr. Jones, he admitted his own financial difficulties and that he had been the beneficiary of the policy. He stated he had no knowledge of poison in his sister's house. Surgeon George Foster testified next, describing the post-mortem and the preservation of the organs. Mr. Brown presented the chemist's certificate. The clerk handed it to the judge, then to the jury foreman. The chemist, John Sterry, was called. He took the stand, a meticulous man in a black suit. He described the Marsh Test in detail. Brown asked for the conclusion. Sterry stated the stomach contents, liver and kidneys of the deceased contained arsenic in quantities I calculate to be no less than 2 grains. This is a fatal dose. The teapot, cup and caddy were displayed on a table but not passed to the jury. A witness from the Prudential Company confirmed the insurance policy. The prosecution rested. The defense called its first witness, a traveling huckster named Joseph Lee. He stated under oath that he had sold tea to Sarah Dazley in September, that it was a common blend, and that he sold no poisons. Under cross-examination, he admitted he could not be certain of the exact date. Mr. Jones then called Sarah Dazley herself. It was uncommon, but not unprecedented. She stepped from the dock into the witness box. The court fell silent. She gave her account of the evening, her voice steady but low. She stated she had made tea for them both, but had poured her own cup from the pot first and found it too hot, setting it aside to cool. She had then poured Eliza's cup. She had not drunk from hers later, as she forgot it. She denied purchasing or possessing arsenic. Brown rose for cross-examination. He questioned her on her relationship with Eliza, on the loan, on her knowledge of the insurance. He asked why, if the tea was bitter, she urged Eliza to drink it. She replied, "I thought it was the type of tea." He asked where the arsenic could have come from, if not from her. She said, "I do not know." Her hands, resting on the ledge of the witness box, were perfectly still. The judge interjected with occasional questions for clarification. Her testimony concluded, she returned to the dock. Mr. Jones called a character witness, a neighbour from Wrestlingworth, who described Sarah as a good mother and hard-working. The defence rested. Mr. Justice Coleridge began his summation to the jury at 3:20. He reviewed the evidence methodically. He instructed them that motive alone was insufficient, that they must be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the accused administered the poison. He noted the lack of direct evidence placing arsenic in her possession. He also noted the peculiar circumstance of the 2 cups. The jury retired to consider their verdict at 3:50. The courtroom emptied slowly, a low murmur of conversation filling the space. Sarah Dazley remained in the dock, a wardress beside her. She stared at her hands in her lap. The jury was out for 1 hour and 17 minutes. The courtroom fell silent, save for the scratch of the clerk's pen on parchment. They returned at 5:07. The foreman stood. The clerk asked, "Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?" The foreman replied, "We have. Do you find the prisoner at the bar guilty or not guilty of the charge of murder?" "Guilty." The word hung in the air. Sarah Dazley did not move. The judge called for silence. He addressed her, asking if she had anything to say before sentence was passed. She looked up at him, her face pale. She said, "I am not guilty, my lord." Mr. Justice Coleridge placed the black cap upon his wig. He spoke the formulaic words, The sentence of the court is that you be taken from hence to the place from whence you came, and from thence to a place of execution, and there be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your body be afterwards buried within the precincts of the prison in which you shall have been confined after your conviction. And may the Lord have mercy on your soul. Death. Sarah Dazley was returned to the condemned cell at Bedford Jail at 5:45 on the evening of her conviction. This cell was slightly larger than her previous one, containing a table, 2 chairs, and a small fireplace that was kept lit. A wardress was in constant attendance day and night. Reverend Mortimer visited daily. He reported she was resigned but maintained her innocence. She received no family visits. Her 2 children, aged 8 and 6, were in the care of the parish. She was allowed to write 1 letter, which she addressed to her brother, William Cooper. Its contents were not recorded. The execution was set for Monday, March 12th. On the morning of the 11th, the prison governor, the surgeon, and the chaplain visited her together to confirm the sentence would be carried out. She listened without visible reaction. That afternoon she was measured by the executioner, William Calcraft, who had travelled from London. He noted her height and weight for the calculation of the drop. On the final evening, she ate a small supper of bread and broth. She spent several hours with Reverend Mortimer, who read from the Psalms. She asked him once, "Will it be quick?" He assured her it would be instantaneous. She slept fitfully, according to the wardress's log. On Monday, March 12th, she was woken at 7 o'clock. The morning was clear and cold, with a sharp frost whitening the prison roofs. She dressed in the same grey dress, over which a white linen shift was placed, as was customary. Her hair was tightly braided and pinned close to her head. She took a little tea. At 7:45, the governor, the chaplain, the surgeon, the under-sheriff, and 2 wardresses entered the cell. Calcraft, the executioner, waited outside. The procession formed. She walked unaided, her steps firm on the stone flags. They exited the cell block into the inner yard, crossing 30 yards of open ground to a low brick shed built against the north wall. The execution scaffold was inside to shield it from public view. The shed's double doors stood open. Within, the structure was simple, a wooden platform 12 feet by 8 with a trapdoor in the center. A beam overhead supported the rope. Around the platform stood the required witnesses: the governor, the surgeon, the chaplain, the under-sheriff, the 2 wardresses, and 4 newspaper reporters admitted by ticket. The crowd that had gathered outside the prison walls was audible only as a low, distant murmur. She mounted the 4 wooden steps to the platform with Calcraft's assistance. Reverend Mortimer stood beside her, reading from the prayer book, "Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live." Calcraft positioned her on the trapdoor, placed the white hood over her head, and adjusted the noose, a hempen rope with a brass eyelet, around her neck. She made no final statement. Her hands, bound in front of her, held a small handkerchief. The chaplain concluded with "Amen." Calcraft stepped quickly to the lever. 8 o'clock. The trap fell with a crash. The body dropped approximately 4 feet, jerked once, and then hung still. The surgeon, Mr. Edwin Linton, stepped forward immediately. He monitored the pulse at the wrist, then placed a mirror before the mouth and nose. He checked at 1-minute intervals. At 8:04, he announced, "Life is extinct." The body was left suspended for the customary hour. The witnesses signed the execution book, which recorded the time of death as 8 o'clock. The bell of St. Paul's Church tolled a single heavy note. At 9 o'clock, the body was cut down and placed in a plain pine coffin that had been standing ready in a corner of the shed. The coffin was carried to the prison mortuary. There, the surgeon completed the death certificate. Cause of death, judicial hanging. Time, 8 o'clock, March 12, 1849. The coffin was nailed shut. At noon, it was transported by cart to the unconsecrated burial ground within the prison walls, behind the laundry. Present were the chaplain, the surgeon, the governor, and 2 convict labourers. The grave had been dug to a depth of 8 feet. The coffin was lowered. No religious service was performed. The chaplain turned and walked away before the first shovel of earth was thrown. The grave was filled and levelled. A wooden stake marked the site with the painted number 117. The convict labourers returned to their work. The governor's report was dispatched to the Home Office that afternoon. Sarah Dazley's personal effects, valued at 2 shillings, were retained by the prison until claimed. No one ever claimed them. The trial transcript was bound in calfskin and placed in the Crown Court archives at the Shire Hall. The conviction rested on the chemist's certificate, the testimony regarding the bitter tea, and the circumstantial evidence of motive. The prison register was closed, the entry inked in a steady hand. William Cooper collected the £10 insurance payment from the Prudential Office in Bedford on March 21st.